What's going on, coders, and welcome to episode 8 of our Pandas playlist. Now, today's episode is going to be fairly short, but we're also going to be covering a pretty important topic known as grouping. So let's buckle down and get going. Alright, so I have selected just one method for this episode, and that's going to be groupby. Now, if you have any familiarity with SQL, the SQL groupby is very similar in functionality to this Pandas groupby. And basically what this does is that we group together similar values in our data set, and then we can perform some aggregation function on it, right? So we can maybe take the mean per group. Now let's jump into the code and see what I mean by that. Let's start off by importing pandas as pd, like we always do, and then taking a glance at our student's data frame, which we'll be using to demo today. So let's say that you wanted to find the average math score per race or ethnicity in your data frame. And so far what we've learned in this playlist is how to find the average math score of an entire column. So if we wanted to find, say, the average math score per race or ethnicity, knowing what we know so far, what we would probably do is set up a filter and filter out all of the values that aren't first African American, and then finding the average math score of that, and then filtering out all of the values that aren't, say, Asian American, and then finding the average math score of that. But that would actually take many different computations, and there's a way to do that all in one, and that is known as groupby. So again, this is what we know so far. We would just take, say, the mean of the math score column, and if I run that, that would give us 66.089. However, we want to find the average math score per value in this, or per group in this column right here, race or ethnicity. So let's do that. So first what we need to do is we need to create a group, what's known as a groupby object. We would use the method .groupby and then pass in the column name that we're going to want to group by. So if I run this, what I'm going to get is just a pandas groupby object. So it's not really helpful as is, like this, right? It's not really displaying any data or running any calculations. It's just saying that, yep, you have created a groupby object. So on this object, there are various properties and methods that are actually pretty helpful. So if I were to run this first line right here, this is going to get the number of groups in this groupby. So it looks like there are 5 distinct groups in this race or ethnicity column. If I wanted to actually take a look at those groups, I could then run the second line, and I could run the property.groups on our groupby object. And what that's going to do is it's going to return for us a dictionary where the keys are the actual group name. So it looks like we have African American there, we have Asian American here, multiracial, we have Native American, and then white American. So that will be our 5 groups. And then as the values of each of those keys, we have the indices that correspond to that group, right? So we have, okay, for African American, we have 0, 2, 5, 6. If we come back up here in our data frame, then, yep, index 0 is definitely African American. Index 2 is African American as well. And we can't see 5 or 6, but I'll bet you a lot of money that those are also African American as well. Cool. All right, so that's n groups and groups. We can also run this method called first. So this was just going to get us a sample, a very small sample of each of the groups, right? So this is going to get us the first record that appears for each of these groups. So for African American, this is the first record that shows up. For Asian American, it's this one, and this just kind of gives you the tiniest of samples of each of these groups. Cool. Now, if you wanted to actually get all of the records for a particular group, let's say that we wanted to look at the African American, all of the records for this group, you could use the method getGroup and then pass in that group name. So if I were to run this, here we go. Now we have a data frame that is all of the records for African American. And this is basically the equivalent of just filtering out all of the records that don't contain African American. But again, this is just another way of doing that. Awesome. So those are some pretty helpful properties and methods on the group by object, but the real power of group bys is again running aggregation functions on it. So we could first just run an aggregation function on the group by object itself. If we were to do that, then what that's going to do is it's going to get all of the columns that are numerical and then run whatever function you give it, right? So the mean function. So it looks like now for African American, the average math score would be 63, Asian would be 64. And by the way, all of this data is fabricated, so don't look into these numbers too much. This is just for, again, demonstration purposes. But again, it's kind of cool because now we have run the mean function on each of the numerical columns for each of the groups. But however, again, most times you'll be interested in just a specific column. So for instance, math score, what we could do is treat this group by object similar to its own data frame, and then use that same convention of accessing a column using bracket notation on that group by object, and then running a aggregation function on that. So if I were to run this, and here we go, now we have the average math score of each of the race or ethnicities, just like this, and this answers our original question. Awesome, so that is pretty cool. So there's a couple optional arguments for the group by object, and I've listed them up here. There's even more than this, but this is what I'm going to be demoing. So the first one is sort. So by default, it sorts your groups by alphabetically, or if it's in numerical groups, it sorts it in ascending order. So if I were to now say sort equals false, then it's just going to group now by not alphabetically anymore, but by appearance. And the reason why you would want to say sort equals false is just that you get some performance improvements saying sort equals false. Another thing that you could do is say drop an A equal to false. Now the default is true, and what that means is that if it encounters a null value or a missing value in this column, race or ethnicity, it's just going to ignore that. But if we were to say drop NA is equal to false, then now all of the missing values, all of the NANs, are going to be treated as a group in and of itself. Cool, so that's just a handy little optional argument that you have at your disposal. So the last thing that we're going to look at is how to group by multiple columns. So that you can do that, instead of just passing in the column name as, say, like a string, you can actually pass in a list of column names that you want to group by. So first we're going to group by race or ethnicity, and then after that we're going to group by test preparation course. So let's take a quick look at that, and here we go. So now we have, all right, first we're grouping by race or ethnicity, but then as a secondary grouping, we're grouping by test preparation course. So now we're getting the average math score based on if you completed versus not completed the test for every single race or ethnicity. So now it's kind of cool. We can compare within its own race or ethnicity how well these students did based on whether they completed the preparation course or not. So it looks like, at least in this mock data, that if you did complete the test preparation course, you performed better than if you didn't, regardless of race or ethnicity. Awesome, and there's one more thing. Based on how this looks right now, this might look a little bit confusing. What this is actually formatted as is that right here, there are actually two indices for this series. But if this looks kind of weird to you, what you can do is that you can just say as index equal to false. And that's going to give you a data frame. It's kind of like reducing the dimensions down to just one single data frame. And this is similar to how the SQL group by works, or the similar result set of a SQL group by. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something from it. If you did, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. and I'll see you in the very next episode.